now. Great, so welcome to the second session of the 2022 Dev Conference. And our first speaker today is Ryan Beall, and talking about Barometric Altitude Calibration Model. Over to you, Ryan.
Afternoon, morning, evening to all the listeners. So I'll be talking a little bit today about the Barometric Altitude Calibration Model that's in ArduPilot and some findings that I had. So next slide. So a quick overview, what this talk is about and specifically what it isn't about, to kind of draw a line in the sand to really understand exactly what we're getting at. Then I'll do a quick overview of the 1976 US standard atmosphere, just as kind of a background of understanding of what's in the current code base, its flaws and things to that nature, and how it's used with respect to general aviation. Then I'll talk about the barometric calibration problem that I found, and then my take on the solution, a little bit of code review, and then finish it up with to-do improvements and questions. Okay, so what this talk is about versus what it isn't. On the left there, you can see some calibration curves with respect to the geometric altitude in feet and then inches of mercury, and you can see a couple of lines there with respect to various temperatures. Blue line is, the standard model, and the various offsets there are just at different delta C temperatures from the standard model. There's going to be a better picture of this later on, but more specifically, that's what we're talking about, is what does this calibration look like and what errors can pop up if you do this incorrectly. What we're not talking about specifically is datum changes by the operator, things like Q&E, QNH, QFE. If you're not familiar with those terms, that's fine. We won't be discussing them, but if you're a pilot and you're wanting to get that out of this brief, that will be the 2.0 version of this brief. So I wanted to draw a line in the sand there to specifically focus on the calibration piece, because I think it's first and foremost, flight safety critical. And then I do know that, even as an operator myself, working in manned airspace, that the right problem set there with datum changes is important. And there are some areas that we can improve on that in the ArduPilot code stack, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. And the reason why I draw the line specifically is because this conversation can kind of get muddied in between the two, and that's where we're at up front. Okay, so a little bit of background, the 1976 standard atmosphere model. This is straight from Wikipedia, so I won't bore you with the reading, but focusing on the picture on the right there, you can see that the ArduPilot model is in that 11,000 or 11,000 meters or 11 kilometer range in that red box. And you can see it represents the nonlinearity of density, pressure, speed of sound, and temperature. So in the bottom left, you can see down here, the specifically line 395, the code base that's been there for years, probably 10 years, essentially is just a mathematical model of this very curve, right? So as pressure changes, how can I expect the geometric altitude to then follow? And then mapping that pressure change into an altitude estimate that I can feed to the EKF and use for altitude hold, what have you. So what the problem I stumbled into was, we're flying an aircraft. You can see our altitude profiles there to the right, up to about 6,000 feet. We typically fly anywhere between that range and up to even 10,000 feet to 12,000 feet. And what you'll notice is that the barometric altitude in feet is in red and the GPS altitude is in green. And if you look closely, the higher you go, the higher the discrepancy is between the altitude. More specifically, we noticed in our ADS-B readouts, as reported by ATC, in trying to coordinate our airspace management, that the barometric reading was incorrect, but GPS and ADS-B tended to align with each other. And that specific error was consistent flight to flight, multiple flights a day, and then across multiple days as well. And so like it's written there, we cross-checked ADS-B with GPS and barometrics to identify which one was the likely culprit. And ultimately, it led us to believe that it was barometrics. And then upon code review, I highlighted two problems that I'll talk about in the next slide. So in my previous background was as a MH-60 Sierra pilot in the Navy, and the Blackhawk has what's called a RAD-out, a radar altimeter. One unique feature about that helicopter is it has what's called bar out sync or rad out sync. And so you can basically sync your altimeter setting off the off the rad out. And that only really applies when you're over water, obviously, but it's a great feature to have because if you're, alone and unafraid, 200 nautical miles away from anybody that has a reporting altimeter setting, you basically can use your own altimeter setting as long as you're over the water. So it's a nice feature. You can hit the rad out button and you can sync it. So why do I say all that? I say all that because I noticed back when I was flying the helicopter that as I would climb, I'd continually have to resync my rad out to my bar out. Almost every 100 feet, I would notice like 10 feet off, 20 feet off or so. And that's when I kind of stumbled into this problem of the altitude that you fly in general aviation, military, civilian, what have you, is non-temperature compensated, but pressure compensated. So when you put in your altimeter setting, that's what you're doing is you're pressure compensating your altitude. However, you're not temperature compensating. So you can imagine, the complexities in doing so. In flying an old 1970 Cessna or whatever, doing temperature compensation is not going to be easy for most instrumentation, especially analog. So the key here is this non-temperature compensated piece is, it's clearly not as accurate. It's not, a correct actual geometric altitude. However, everybody's flying on the wrong sheet of music is what I like to say. So under this paradigm, that totally explains why the altitude, doesn't match reality with respect to what GPS is reporting. So is this fine? Is this not fine? It depends. In our case, we were flying in manned airspace with manned aircraft and we have to deconflict with manned aircraft. So we need to be on the same sheet of music as manned aircraft. So in code review, this is an oversimplification, but you can see how in line 387, starting there is the get altitude difference equation. ArduPilot is temperature compensating the barometric readings. So you can manually disable this by setting the baro ground temp parameter to 15 because non-temperature compensated barometric readings are based off of standard day, and standard day is defined as 15 degrees Celsius. So that is one way that you can fix part of the problem. The second part of the problem is much more difficult to fix, and is why I added some code. So the second part of the problem is that the pressure compensation is incorrect. So as you can see in line 391, the base pressure comes in, and I skipped a bunch of code here, but the basic idea is when base pressure comes into this function, it's based off of the pressure as the autopilot was booted up. So the autopilot boots up, it takes an average pressure reading and assumes that that's the base level pressure, which ultimately makes all of the rest of the equation for the return here in your geometric altitude that's output always be zero basically when you're on the ground. There's one problem with this, and that is it doesn't include this field elevation term, which I'll get to kind of in the next slide. So assume that this isn't here for now because this is technically the code that I'm running now. But it always assumes this code base doing it this way without the field elevation correction. It always assumes that the airplane is turning on at sea level. And that can cause offset errors as well. So this is just the same, example that I gave before with respect to altitude difference when you include temperature compensation versus when you don't. So these curves up here to the right are at various different temperatures, and you can see that they vary from the standard model by a decent amount, especially the higher you go, which is why this problem hasn't been picked up for most people, for the past 10 years, is because most people don't fly these airplanes that high. It just so happens that we do, and we have been pretty consistently. And so you can see that you can have 10%, 15% error relative altitude. So at 12,000 feet, 10% is quite a bit of error. And obviously the other thing to highlight here is this model is nonlinear. So as I stated before, if you start at zero, the gradient of geometric height to barometric pressure is not as steep as it is at 12,000 feet. And so making sure that you start at the right spot in this curve is important. So I'll talk about how I fix that. So here's the overview of the solution. So the first thing I wanted to do was validate the ArduPilot standard atmosphere model, then remove temperature compensation, or in this case, make the temperature compensation optional. So if you wanted to absolutely fly, a pristine altitude and not worry about flying in accordance with non-temperature compensated manned aviation, like you could totally do that. Then I wanted to correct the pressure compensation piece of it, add any parameters that were needed for ease of use, as well as adding safety checks. And then if possible, make it backwards compatible so that, if we roll this forward, it's not going to have any hiccups for people using it kind of as they always have been. This is like kind of an upgrade if you change your settings or parameters and configuration. So this one, I'll just briefly go over this. It's really straightforward. I took the 1976 model. I took the ArduPilot model. I plotted them over top of each other. It checks out. And as the code says, it's within plus or minus 5 meters all the way up to 11,000 meters. And that concurred. I think that's good to go. So that was a quick sanity check just to make sure it was good. The next step was removing the temperature compensation. So for now, just look through lines 527 through 530. And all I did is essentially remove the reset to 0 on every boot, such that as the user, you can define it as 15C and it'll stay that way. And so it's pretty straightforward. I think, dealer's choice there, like we could leave that in or we could leave that out, but having to set that for us in our daily operations, because we need to fly in accordance with manned operations, having to reset that on pre-flight every single flight was not really conducive. And if you are flying in manned, consideration, you would want that to be default to 15 always.
So Ryan, just about that one, it says there's standard day temp. I presume that's just, a standard day. That doesn't vary at night, I presume, in manned aviation?
No, no.
They still use 15 at night, right? So the fact that it says day temp does not imply a particular time of the day or range of hours. Yeah,
that's correct. I don't know if that's like common vernacular, in pilot world or what, I'm not sure, but,
right.
But yeah, that's a pretty, at least I think in aerospace engineering, I think it's common vernacular. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's what that implies. Yep,
yeah,
that's correct.
Standard days. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. And then, like I said, if you do want temperature compensation, then you can just set it back to 0 and you're right back in the game. But the main thing here is that this piece doesn't reset. Okay, then to fix the pressure compensation, it requires a new parameter, and I named it barrel field elevation. The units are in meters, and you can see how it's applied here. And I'll kind of walk through this. Some of this you'll kind of have to push the I believe button because it's hard to put all this into one slide. But the basic idea is when you set your altimeter setting in the airplane, it effectively is doing the same thing in code. So what you have to figure out is what is the equivalent sea level pressure that would result in the pressure I'm reading at, say, 4,000 feet on the runway, that would result in me seeing 4,000 feet on the altimeter. Okay, so what I added was a function that calculates that sea level pressure to then preload the base pressure, the baseline pressure, pushing you all the way down the curve onto the right spot. Okay. And all this get sea level pressure code is doing is the inverse algebra of get altitude function in baro.cpp. So all these numbers are just the inverted algebra. And so if you apply that and you get that baseline pressure, what'll end up happening is it will say that you're at 4,000 feet, let's say, right? Well, in ArduPilot's vernacular, or however you want to call it, you start off on boot, you start off at 0 altitude. So it's relative to takeoff or relative to home. And so in order to get that back down to 0 and make it, relative to home, I have to subtract off the field elevation. And also for this calculation to work the algebra backwards, you need to know the starting elevation of where you're at. I'll talk a little bit about making this automated in the future, but let's table that for now, and I'll talk about future growth of how to make that not a parameter and more automated going down the line. So the next part of this is making this auto calibration easier to use. So the pre-flight process is basically set by the user. So as you boot up, barrel field elevation is reset to 0 on every flight to prevent you from having a pre-saved field elevation of 4,000 feet, and then I go fly at sea level, and now my numbers are all wrong. So I reset it to 0, which effectively makes the math exactly the same as it was before. But part of your pre-flight process is, say I'm flying at 4,000 feet, I set barrel field elevation to 4,000 feet. What immediately would happen then is if you did nothing, then you would just add a delta of 4,000 feet into your barometric equation. So what you need to do is then rerun the calibration process. So it then runs all the algebra in reverse and fills out all the numbers correctly to put you on the right 1976 curve with no temperature compensation. The key part here is adding a safety feature so that you can't do that in flight, because you can imagine playing that forward, it will bite you. So you should not be able to do this in flight. And you can see here on line 922, I'm checking to see if the aircraft is armed. If it's not armed, then I return to the user a MAV severity info saying barometer field elevation set or not set. So if it fails to set it, it will tell you like, hey, you're not configured correctly. And I've primarily used MAV proxy, so I see those messages. I'm not sure if that shows up in Mission Planner. I'm sure Tridge can answer that, but that's at least the level of information that I have set now is alert and info. Others could weigh in as to whether or not we could improve that or not. So the last piece is this backwards compatible? The short answer is yes, absolutely. So you set your ground temp to 0, and that, per the standard code base, turns on temperature compensation, and baro field elevation to 0, leaves it as is. It doesn't change the math and results in no changes to the barometric altitude calculation as is. I think I have these set as the default parameters as it stands. So if this PR is accepted, then essentially, almost every single user would gain the benefits of having proper calibration if they turn it on and use it, but no detriment if they don't. Here's the PR. Nothing to really say there. I don't need to go through it per se. I've gone through most of the code. And then to-dos improvements. Automatic field elevation update on EKF3 alignment. So one thing that could be added is as soon as the EKF3 is happy with the GPS position that it has, the fix is good enough to take for the alignment, you could take that field elevation and run it back through and skip the whole need for having the baro field elevation parameter itself. I wanted to get this PR in quickly because we need it for our everyday ops. And so I kept with something that was, very baseline and simple. It didn't change too much. With respect to EKF and like any kind of gotchas there that this algorithm or improvement might change, if you just throw in the offset, the EKF will not be happy. But the current code that I've written now automatically triggers the EKF to realign specifically in the vertical channel. So it's just like doing a normal baro calc or cal on pre-flight. So the EKF does stay happy. One thing I haven't spent much time thinking about is the implications of needing to change the field elevation when landing in a different landing site. This kind of is, crossing that line in the sand that I drew in the initial part of the brief with respect to, what is this brief about and what it's not. Same kind of thing with this specific code PRs. I think, as it stands right now, if you were to change the field elevation in flight, like I said, the safety feature is going to prevent you from doing it. And so the only way that you could really land at an offsite landing site is to change your baro offsets. And maybe there's a couple other tricks that people use, but that's the general idea, is that you wouldn't be able to then put in a field elevation. And similar fashion, like I think, as far as improvements, getting to kind of the 2.0 version of this modification would be having, an altimeter setting that you could put in like 299 for inches of mercury, or what have you. But that's for further down the line. The main thing I wanted to fix was the calibration piece, and I think this PR represents a pretty good solution to that. I think always welcome for discussion and more improvements, and that's all I have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ryan. So I wanted this talk to be partly sort of a discussion in the dev team about how we approach this, and we've got quite a few people here who do fly, in piloted vehicles, and so I thought getting all their input. So there's a few things that come to mind. First of all, I think we do want some way of setting this automatically, either with a baro options bit mask or a baro field mode or elev mode or similar sort of enum, where you can automate this. And we actually had something similar. We recently put a hook in the terrain code. When you arm, it goes and tells the terrain code to take the current location as a baseline for offsetting the terrain height. In other words, take it as a reference location and assuming you're on the ground. So we could actually, in that same hook, tell the Barrow library, okay, you are now arming on the ground, set your field elevation, and that should allow this to be automated. Whether we should do it by default. Another thing that occurs to me is the EKF. I don't know if is Paul on the call. I don't think he was able to make it this morning. Paul, are you here? No, I don't see Paul here at the moment, unfortunately. So the I believe the EKF tries to cope with barrow drift in long flights. And what it does is it assumes that the GPS is long-term stable, and it uses the long-term drift of the GPS height to correct the barrow height. Now, I wonder how that's going to impact on this, because if we're now shifting over to where there's, as you say, the different song sheets, so the barometric altitude is going to be different to the GPS altitude. If the EKF is trying to correct the barometric altitude, and it does that by either shifting the origin or adding an offset, it's got two different modes of operation. Is it going to understand this difference between the barometric and GPS altitude, or is it going to effectively try to remove it because it's trying to drift one towards the other over a long flight? So I wonder whether that's coped with properly.
I sort of wonder on that point. I wonder why Ryan wasn't seeing the two correct, wasn't seeing the barometer, or maybe Ryan was you were looking at the altitude reported by the barometer and not the EKF altitude. I'm just wondering if you saw a difference, if you saw three different altitudes, and barometer altitude, GPS altitude, and then an EKF altitude just somehow in the middle, or if it was always stuck to the barometer altitude. Because if it was always stuck to the barometer altitude, then that sort of sounds like there's something stopping that correction from happening.
You actually wouldn't see the default mode of operation, I think, in EK3 is to shift the origin, which means your relative origin altitude can start shifting away from your barometric altitude, and because it shifts the origin to take account of the relative drift between the barrow and the GPS. But this is something where we'll need to get Paul involved. But
I can tell you, a couple of observations along those lines that I've seen thus far is that, so we'll climb up to like 12,000 feet, fly the airplane for multiple hours, and it, over those multiple hours, it doesn't collapse, it doesn't close on itself, right? So I can cross check with ADS-B and it'll say that I'm 200 to 400 feet off, and that doesn't decrease over time; it stays there consistently. So that's one observation. Right. Okay. And the other initial observation that I had with Paul is how to properly deal with the reset or the calibration on the ground. And initially I just threw it in there, did the math, and obviously the EKF is going to complain about it. And the normal way that the EKF complains is it looks at the innovation, it times out and says, hey, the innovation's too high, force a reset, force a realignment on the vertical channel. So I was unhappy with that. It was like this, as the user, like you change the field elevation, you've got to wait 15 to 30 seconds or whatever the time that is. I think it's like 15 seconds for your actual HUD to update your altitude. I was like, this isn't right. So I reached out to Paul and said, hey, what's the proper way to do a force to reforce an alignment? And he said, hey, here's the hook for it. You can actually do it just on the vertical channel, and it fixed all those problems. The point I bring here is that in that conversation that we had talked about, the realignment piece was, we discussed how having the wrong altitude affects the EKF a little bit. And the pieces that he illustrated to me were that the vertical acceleration bias that gets calculated, obviously the innovation on that estimate goes through the roof, and that's why it resets. So, and pertaining to your question specifically, Tridge, by not doing temperature compensation, what's happening is, at least the way I would understand it would be, you're not flying a true altitude, a true geometric altitude, because you don't know about the temperature. So you're going to be off by a little bit. That could roll into acceleration bias in the EKF. And so what we would need to validate is that bias going to affect or cause a realignment in flight or be detrimental to the EKF? I think a priori we can figure out pretty easily with equations like what that's going to look like. You can calculate the delta height between true altitude and indicated altitude without temperature compensation. It's actually a common thing in the pilot world for people that fly high. I didn't know it because as a helicopter pilot, we only flew at 500 feet almost always.
I don't think the accel bias is going to be impacted significantly, because I think that the main contributor to that is going to be the vertical velocity, which is typically taken as a GPS vertical velocity. And so I'd be surprised if you get any significant thing on the accel bias, but the origin shift could be significant.
Yeah. We've flown it now. We've test flown this code both on smaller airplanes that are surrogate airplanes, as well as our full-size airplane. I can't tell you how many flight hours we have on at this point, but at least tens of hours. It is pretty new. Obviously, we haven't been flying it all that much because this code is pretty new. Nothing is
good to have a look at what's happening to the origin to see whether the origin altitude is shifting. I mean, you'll only be really noticeable when you've got a big altitude delta between your takeoff height and your flight height. It would have to be, which you of course obviously do in your vehicles. You've got a very large altitude delta. I'm interested to see what happens to the EKF origin. And there's two different modes of operation the EKF's got for doing this drift between GPS and baro. And one of them adds an offset to the computed altitude, and the other one shifts the origin. So there's sort of two different ways of approaching it that are implemented in the EKF. So I'm interested in the way we can automate this. Should we make this type of behavior of setting that field elevation be the default? That's one of the sort of the key questions. It sounds like we probably should, if we can work out a reliable way of determining when you are on the ground. And we've got several different ways of doing that. At the point of arming, we could assume we're on the ground. What I did for the terrain one recently was assume on the ground if you have low velocity when you arm. And there are times when that's wrong. I mean, if you were doing a balloon drop, you might take it up to 70,000 feet, you might have low velocity, and then you release and you might arm at that point, right? So there needs to be a way to turn it off for those rare cases. I mean, the existence of those rare cases of people dropping from a balloon shouldn't preclude us from automating it. It just means there needs to be a way to disable that behavior. And so I think probably an altitude handling enum as a parameter in the Baro library, and to say, and it would default to the correct setting for automating integration into piloted airspace, national airspace. I'm trying to avoid, in Australia, there's a big thing to not use the word manned anymore, to be gender neutral, so piloted. So it should probably be that by default, but anyone see any real downsides to that being the default?
I think you're not going to see much of a change, because for most people that most users are flying relatively low. So as long as you're flying less than 1,000 feet, you really won't even see the delta in air. It's not until you get in the thousands or tens of thousands that you see it.
I mean, some people fly high AMSL, but they typically fly 1 to 2,000 AGL above, or at least above the field elevation. But when they do go to higher altitudes, I think the default behavior probably should try to be correct for integration into, with other airspace users. But there should be a way to turn that off. So And I think, as you say, I think probably the doing it in the same hook. So if you have a look in the AP arming library, it's got a call into the terrain code to say, okay, lock your reference now. And I think if we did it at the same point, Randy?
I totally agree with the concept, like that we need a very similar hook, but I think it should be a separate hook actually, because because for the terrain one, and I love that fix by the way, but that terrain hook is basically saying, are you on the terrain or not? And so like if you're on a building, you want to uncheck it. You know, if you're taking out from the top of a building, you want to uncheck it. Whereas I think this is different. I think this should be separate hook. Same idea, but different parameters, what I'm saying.
Now, the other way I guess we could do it is at the point we arm, if the terrain database is available, you know, we take the terrain height and we take our GPS height, and we actually, if terrain is available at the location where we're arming, then we just set the field elevation to the terrain height. And so it doesn't really matter whether you're on a building or not, and that would even cope with dropping from a balloon, you know, because what you really want is your field elevation is the point on the Earth's surface below you. So if terrain was available at the point you arm, you set your field elevation to the terrain height at that point. Does that seem reasonable?
It's also very close to what, yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable to me, but it seems
I mean, some people don't have terrain height.
Like
if you don't have terrain height, then you just take the GPS height at the point you arm.
Yeah. But also that terrain height, like it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Like you just have to get under the right part of the curve.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
If you're off by 30 meters, it's a very,
matter.
very small error. It's only
That's
if you're off by, you know, 1,000 meters that it starts to matter. And so the terrain height would actually be a fairly reliable field elevation, I would expect, assuming terrain data is available.
Exactly. That's not available in like Finland or something.
There are, yeah, there's some latitudes where terrain data is not available. Okay, so if we had it a baro parameter, you know, baro underscore alt underscore mode, maybe something like that. What do you think, Randy, as a parameter to choose the behavior?
Yeah,
putting your naming hat on.
That. I mean, we could be barrel options.
Something?
To be barrel. Sorry, Josh, go ahead. Sorry.
Like, I mean, I know you're trying to differentiate between 1.0 and 2.0, but like in the end, we need barrel altitude frames somewhere in there. Sort of like we have, you know, altitude frames for terrain, etc. You know, all the different altitude frames. Like it sort of feels like we need something like that for barrow, so that you know, where you start at for missions, like because basically you're trying to get at what is your barrow altitude when you start, and where like you're going to need that information and need to be able to switch between it. I just that this discussion just was a little odd to me and it didn't quite seem right. I can't, sorry, I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I can kind of reiterate what you're saying, Josh. So from a calibration perspective, you know, say like the balloon drop scenario, which is, you know, rare, but kind of an interesting one to highlight all the issues. When the autopilot boots up and it grabs its initialization pressure, I liken this to, say, the gyros, right? The gyros need to not be moving when they initialize. But with respect to like changing environments with respect to temperature or altitude, like it's almost impervious because the EKF is tracking the biases, you know, throughout the rest of the flight. Same thing for like the balloon drop. You know, you want to know that, you know, your GPS altitude is say 4,000 meters. The barometric offset that I'm grabbing is, you know, is some, you know, kilopascals or pascals. And that's my baseline that I start with, just like I would in zero rotation on my gyros. Now, the second piece of this problem is probably what you're getting at, Josh. And I would throw this into like the 2.0 conversation, which is, okay, I'm in a balloon and now my altitude is 0, but I'm going down. So my altitude is going to be negative the whole way down. The cool part about what this algorithm is doing is it's making sure that as you do go down, that you're following the right gradient in pressure versus geometric altitude. And all of that is going to be accurate for you. The conversation I think that you're raising is like, okay, but as a user, do I want to see my altitude go negative? Do I need to change my data frame? Like, I think that's That's correct. Because I mean, what I would do then is like I would throw in, you know, my baro alt offset to like 4,000 feet, so that way I could see my altitude is at 4,000 feet. But that's going to get a little dicey, and I think that's you know, a further down the road conversation with respect to, like I said, 2.0 of this version of code.
Yeah,
I think in all situations you're going to want to start at that calibrated point, that known reference point of altitude and pressure. That's going to stay the same regardless of what datum you change on the backside.
So the user can already display the height above terrain. And so a balloon drop, you could display that, or you could display the height above sea level. I think height above or below arming point is not such a useful thing to display for a balloon drop, and the user can configure their ground station to display either the terrain height or AMSL. So I don't think that what it displays there isn't really a big issue. I'm just thinking about, you know, how we initialize this and how we, a default setting that will do the right thing or close to the right thing for integration with other airspace users. And I think probably pulling, if the terrain height is available, and setting your field elevation to that terrain height is probably the right thing. With actually changing the parameter automatically is maybe not the best. We've had a bad history of sort of, we set parameters. The problem with setting parameters is then people, you know, depending on when they download their parameters, they end up with a different value, and then they reload their parameters from that old parameter file, and it, you know, it then sets it back to a previous value. So if we had this Baro alt mode, or whatever we're going to call it, then I don't think we would necessarily set that as a parameter field elevation. Instead, if Baro alt mode, we just leave it as an internal variable. We'd want to log that variable to say what it's actually using, but it could just be an internal variable that applies that field elevation offset, so you get on the right point of the curve.
One thing, we have one of our users and longtime testers with a comment on Discord. It's also a UAS fixed wing pilot.
Sorry, you cut off a bit there, Josh. No, I think we lost Josh. All right. So
it's going to be toward man aviation.
Oh, Josh is back again.
Oh,
welcome back. So you cut out for a little while there, Josh. Couldn't hear you for a while.
Okay, so I don't know what got said or not. I was just trying to read this comment from a UAS U.S. Air Force pilot, fixed wing, high altitude. That's passed, and he says, assuming that the piloted airspace altimeter setting and physical field elevation matching perfectly is probably not the quite right angle for this, because it's not necessarily going to be that common, depending upon the settings. This is outside my expertise, but I'm just trying to read comments from those who know better than I.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I wanted this conversation, because I'm not, I don't fly piloted vehicles, and so rely on people like Ryan and Bill and Craig and others that are much more familiar with the details of this topic to try to get it right. I just wanted to bring everyone together on this talk to decide exactly how we're going to handle this, because it's been a topic that's been around for years, and we still don't handle it really correctly, as you discovered, Ryan. I think, I mean, your PR gives a way forward, and with defaulting it to 0 is reasonable. Then maybe we need a follow-up PR that adds an automation mechanism, so that and that could be either pulling it from the terrain height if terrain's available. If not, then the GPS height at arming would probably be the fallback, and internally setting that field elevation variable, while leaving the, but if you've got Baro field elevation set, then use that. And one slight problem with 0 is, 0 is a valid field elevation. And so, knowing have they set it or not, we can ask, has the parameter actually been saved? But that isn't always reliable because it might have been changed back. 0 still means saved. So I think there really needs to be a
the
separate
cool part is
parameter.
Well, it still retains the same value and the same exact desired effect, right? Mm-hmm. So in that case, the math is doing exactly what it should be doing. It just so happens that if you leave it the same, it's doing the exact same thing it's always done for the past 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of unique. I think one thing that I hadn't thought of that you caught as a contingency would be as a user, I could see, one of our pilots doing this, right? Grabbing a known parameter list and walking out to the airplane and pushing it. And just so happens that when someone grabbed the param list, they grabbed it from like a log file or another aircraft, like aircraft A on the flight line. They grabbed it and then pushed it and then updated the fuel elevation. And they didn't even know it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And so
that's where making it a hidden variable, making it just an internal variable would be better. Because most people don't think about this issue to nearly the detail that you do. So making it more foolproof, I think would be worthwhile. So I'd say probably something like a Baro alt mode, 0, 1, 2, 3 enum. And we could make it that the default is the current behavior, but I'd actually be tempted to make the default behavior try to integrate properly with other airspace users. And do you see there any real downside of that, of changing the default there? I don't think it's actually going to impact people significantly.
I don't think so. I'd have to do, some quick analysis on how much error is coming from which part of the incorrection. So, there obviously is some error in the temperature compensation being temperature compensated versus not. I think what we've seen the majority of the error being is starting at a non-sea level pressure altitude. So that would actually make things a lot better for most people, more accurate for most people. But like I said, we've probably flown it for 10 to 15 hours so far, maybe a little bit less than that. And we're going to have a lot of flight ops throughout the next couple of months, and so we can report what we see as well. And then it's obviously we can point people to the PR or put it in beta or whatever for people to test and see what we see. I'm not opposed to doing the automated piece. I probably will need some help on the code side of it. So I'm happy to help with that. I think pushing that way would be smart, given the contingency that you highlighted with the parameter nonsense. I like that approach. I knew what my capabilities were from the software side, and I knew I wanted to get it in fast so that people could see it and start talking about it. That was my whole goal.
I think Pete Hall was discussing what this parameter should be called, and the chat, you can see the chat there, Ryan. Baro alt ref from Pete Hall. I quite like that one.
Yeah, we're definitely getting very detailed and stuff. We don't, oops, my camera's not. We don't necessarily have to, get the exact parameter name right now, but one of those I think might be good. Baro cal alt ref, Baro alt ref, something like that. But I think it is calibration related, but maybe we just need to make sure that it's clear in our minds exactly which, features we're turning on and off.
I think the options, I like the options because that could grow us into 2.0 where we deal with datum changes and things like, do you enable the ability to change datums from QNH to QNF or, what have you? That would at least allow that parameter to grow into other things potentially, but I'm indifferent and I trust you guys more than my intuition. So.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a topic that has languished for a long time that we haven't really handled, and the whole sort of doing missions where you move between QFE and QNH type operation. That's a whole nother kettle of fish, as you've said, and that's also worth thinking about. And having a a flight operations guide, how to do that, how to operate in those areas where you're expected to be reporting altitude differently in different phases of flight, and as you move into different airspace regions, you might want to report it as above a QFE altitude when you're close to the airport, and as you get further out, the expectation might be that you start reporting as QNH. Again, we'd need feedback from piloted vehicle people with that experience to know exactly how we should be reporting that.
So at least part of the second phase of this problem set with respect to datum changes is next on our list for sure. You know, given the endurance of the platform is, you know, tens of hours, you can imagine the barometric pressure changes, you know, inside the hour quite frequently. And so over a span of at least 6 hours from morning to mid-afternoon, you could see 30, 40 meters of altitude change off your barometric calibration. And so the way we see it all the time, and we definitely have to deal with it. I think having, you know, the same, I could look at the METAR, the meteorological weather, I could call ATC, what have you, and just get the standard day barometric pressure. I could have the reading on my GCS trailer, what have you, and I could put in the actual, you know, inches of mercury in a parameter. That would be really nice to capture that offset. Obviously, we don't have that now, but
I'm not sure whether a parameter or there's just a Mavlink message that the ground station sends to provide that.
Yeah, or that, yeah.
That might be better because again, the parameter with parameters and saving the same issue. So it might be better actually having a dedicated Mavlink message. It could also be a command long potentially, which means we get an ACK back. And
I think in Mission Planner in the hidden menus, there is this option to push, you know, your altimeter setting. I haven't played with it all that much, and I have to dig into that. So that may kind of already be there.
But I think that changes the parameter. And I think it would be better if there was a Mavlink message for that, which then gets logged. And because we log all command longs, so it might be, I think might be to actually have a command long that the ground station sends. And then it's up to the ground station authors to work out how they go and get that value. And that could be just somebody ringing the, you know, the local tower and then asking them, and then you type it in, or it could be, you could imagine it being automated in some way.
We've talked about and contemplated having, you know, a cube autopilot on the ground do that real time, like every 10 minutes or something. The other thing is like how we're running it right now is just putting in as baro out offset parameter as we see it on the ground. So I can put a cube next to my GCS, I can turn it on, and I can watch how the altitude changes throughout the day, and then I just add that manual offset. That's how we're flying it now. I wouldn't say that's great, but it's better than nothing.
So I used the flight controller on the ground back in the APM2 days for doing this, and then having Mav proxy going and getting it off that, and then putting it up to the aircraft in that parameter. The issue I had actually was if the flight controller's on the ground and the sun hits it directly, it can affect that pressure read quite significantly. And as it heats up, plus the light effect on barrows. So you've got to be a little bit careful about those values.
Something to think about is if you wanted to automate it, I mean, all this data is online. You can just pull it. Like you can just pull it in and send your Mavlink message and automate it as you move.
It was interesting. One of the last customer demos that we had, the customer had, you know, weather across the entire span of the test area. And so I was like, oh, this is great. I'll just get the information from them. And then I checked it from them. And then I checked it from the local, like one of the nearby airports. I checked that value and kind of cross-referenced two more, and then looked at what I saw in the aircraft with respect to GPS, ADSB, et cetera, and like put all that information into one spot. And the trailer right next to me had terrible data. I ended up using the airport data down the street. So it's definitely a hard problem, especially if you got to be within a couple meters, like 4 or 5 meters. It's hard to know which one's correct.
Yeah, and just I work with this is Tom Pittenger. I work with Ryan over at Cross and Downey Aerospace, and we've actually gone down the route of making a little AP Perif box. In fact, we were calling it AP Perif in a box, where it had things like you know, an RTK type of thing and a barometer offset, and all that can just be fed in with a network link into our network hub going into uplink to the aircraft, and to always have a differential GPS or differential barometer kind of all the time, kind of thing. And that's didn't work out so well, and actually caused all these problems that Ryan's been kind of traveling down the path to figure out the root cause of how we're handling barometer in general.
Yeah, at a minimum, Tridge, one of the things that we have been doing is making sure that the cube target temp is at target temp before we cal both autopilots. So that's definitely, a trap for young players if you're getting into that world.
All right. So any more we want to discuss on this before we've got a few minutes before the top of the hour. And do we want to have a break at all between talks or go straight into the second talk? We've got second talk is Jeff. Jeff, are you online?
Yes, I am.
All right. Okay. So what do we want to do is do we want to move on to Jeff's talk sort of straight away, or do we want to? So thank you very much, Ryan. That was absolutely fantastic and really, really great to get that topic covered so thoroughly. And look forward to the 2.0 version where we try to deal with the QFE and the QNH, etc. So do we want to have a break? Anyone feel like we need to have like a bit of a break between talks, or are we going to move straight on?
I think with the lineup you have, you might just want to move straight on.
All right. Okay. Well, Jeff, if you're ready to go, then you can turn on your video and start sharing screen, and I'll introduce you.